In the autumn of 1940, as German paratroopers descended upon the fortress of Eben-Emael and shocked the world with their precision airborne assault, American military observers watched with both admiration and concern. The Wehrmacht's Fallschirmjäger had demonstrated a revolutionary concept of warfare that could bypass traditional defensive lines and strike at the heart of enemy positions with devastating effect. Yet across the Atlantic, the United States Army possessed no such capability, no elite force trained to drop from the sky and seize critical objectives behind enemy lines. The genesis of American airborne forces began not with grand strategy, but with the recognition of a tactical gap that could prove fatal in the coming global conflict. Lieutenant Colonel William P. Ubra, who would later become known as the father of American airborne warfare, observed the German successes and understood that the United States needed its own sky soldiers. Working alongside General Mark Clark and under the watchful eye of Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Yarborough began the painstaking process of creating an entirely new form of military unit. The early development of these airborne forces occurred against a backdrop of skepticism from traditional military commanders who viewed parachute operations as expensive, risky, and of limited tactical value. Many senior officers questioned whether American soldiers, drawn primarily from civilian backgrounds, could master the complex skills required for airborne operations. The training was brutal, the equipment experimental, and the doctrine largely untested in real combat conditions. Yet within the ranks of volunteers who stepped forward to join these experimental units, there burned an intensity and determination that would soon surprise even their harshest critics. The 2nd Battalion, 503rd Parachute Infantry, later redesignated as the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, became America's first airborne unit to see combat, under the aggressive leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Edson D. Graff. These paratroopers underwent intensive training that pushed them far beyond the limits of conventional infantry preparation. They learned to navigate by starlight, to fight as scattered individuals behind enemy lines, and to accomplish their missions regardless of how far they landed from their intended drop zones. The unit's motto became emblematic of the airborne spirit that would define American paratroopers throughout the war: mission first, regardless of cost. The transformation of American airborne doctrine accelerated rapidly as 1942 progressed. The 82nd Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Omar Bradley, was selected for conversion to airborne status, becoming the 82nd Airborne Division under the leadership of Major General Matthew Ridgway. Simultaneously, the 101st Airborne Division was activated, creating the foundation for what would become the most elite infantry formations in the American military. These divisions attracted volunteers from across the United States, men who sought the challenge and prestige of becoming paratroopers, unaware that they were about to revolutionize modern warfare. The training regimen developed for these airborne divisions was unlike anything previously seen in American military history. Paratroopers learned to jump from aircraft at night, to assemble quickly in unfamiliar terrain, and to fight as both individual soldiers and coordinated units against numerically superior forces. They mastered the use of specialized equipment, from folding stock carbines to portable radio sets, all designed to give them maximum firepower and communication capability, despite the weight restrictions imposed by parachute operations. Most importantly, they developed an esprit de corps that bonded them together as an elite brotherhood, men who trusted each other with their lives in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. As 1942 drew to a close, American airborne forces prepared for their first combat test in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. The mission assigned to the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion seemed almost impossible: a 100-mile flight from England across neutral Spain to seize airfields near Oran, Algeria. German intelligence, monitoring Allied preparations, dismissed the American airborne threat as negligible. Experienced Wehrmacht officers, veterans of successful airborne operations in Norway, Belgium, and Crete, viewed the American paratroopers as inexperienced amateurs attempting to master a form of warfare that required years of development and combat experience. This dismissive attitude toward American airborne capabilities would prove to be one of the most significant intelligence failures of the entire war. German commanders, confident in their own military superiority and experienced in dealing with British forces, failed to appreciate the unique characteristics that American paratroopers would bring to European battlefields. They underestimated both the individual fighting spirit of American soldiers and the industrial capacity that would soon equip these airborne divisions with the most advanced equipment and extensive logistical support of any paratroopers in the world. The stage was thus set for a confrontation between two very different military philosophies. German forces, experienced in conventional warfare and confident in their tactical superiority, would soon face American paratroopers who combined innovative tactics with an aggressive fighting spirit that had been forged in the crucible of intensive training. The German officers who mocked the American airborne experiment would soon discover that they had gravely underestimated an opponent who would prove capable of achieving the impossible when the stakes were highest. The cold morning of November 8, 1942, marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of airborne warfare as 39 C-47 transport aircraft lifted off from airfields in Cornwall, England, carrying 556 American paratroopers on the longest combat flight in military history. Operation Torch represented not merely the first American airborne combat operation, but a test of whether the theories and training developed over the previous 2 years could translate into battlefield success against experienced enemy forces. Lieutenant Colonel Edson Raff, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry, understood the magnitude of the challenge facing his men as their aircraft crossed the Bay of Biscay toward the Spanish coast. The mission parameters seemed designed to push every limitation of airborne operations. A flight distance that exceeded the normal range of transport aircraft, navigation over neutral territory where any navigational error could result in internment, and objectives that required precise coordination between scattered parachute drops and conventional ground forces. German intelligence officers, monitoring Allied preparations through various sources, classified the American airborne threat as minimal, viewing the operation as a desperate gamble by inexperienced commanders. The German assessment appeared justified as the American formation encountered severe weather over Spain. Violent winds scattered the aircraft formation, forcing pilots to navigate individually toward targets they could barely identify in the darkness. Several aircraft ran out of fuel before reaching their drop zones. Others became hopelessly lost in the storm, and still others faced hostile fire from French fighters that intercepted them near their objectives. Private Tommy McCall, mortally wounded by French fire, became the first American paratrooper to die in combat. His sacrifice later memorialized in the naming of Camp McCall, the airborne training center near Fort Bragg. Despite these setbacks, the scattered American paratroopers demonstrated a flexibility and determination that surprised both their enemies and their own commanders. Small groups of soldiers, landing miles from their intended drop zones, oriented themselves using basic navigation skills and began moving toward their assigned objectives. Unlike their German counterparts, who relied heavily on detailed planning and precise execution, these American paratroopers adapted to chaos and turned dispersal into an advantage. They appeared simultaneously at multiple locations around Oran, creating the impression of a much larger force and preventing French defenders from concentrating their resistance. The tactical results of Operation Torch's airborne component were mixed, but the strategic implications proved profound. While many specific objectives were not achieved according to the original timeline, the mere presence of American paratroopers behind enemy lines created psychological effects that far exceeded their actual numbers. French commanders, already uncertain about their allegiance to the Vichy government, found their defensive planning disrupted by reports of American soldiers appearing unexpectedly throughout their rear areas. The operation demonstrated that American airborne forces, despite their lack of combat experience, possessed an adaptability and aggressive spirit that could overcome significant tactical disadvantages. German observers, analyzing intelligence reports from Operation Torch, began to reassess their earlier dismissive attitudes toward American airborne capabilities. Wehrmacht intelligence officers noted that American paratroopers had demonstrated unusual persistence in pursuing their objectives despite being scattered across vast distances. Unlike European soldiers, who typically operated within established military traditions, these American volunteers appeared willing to improvise solutions to tactical problems that would have paralyzed more conventional forces. This adaptability would prove to be a defining characteristic of American airborne operations throughout the war. The lessons learned in North Africa led to rapid evolution in American airborne doctrine and equipment. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, training in the United States, incorporated the hard-won experience from Operation Torch into their preparation for future operations. Improved navigation equipment, better coordination procedures, and enhanced individual soldier equipment all reflected the realities discovered in combat. Most significantly, American airborne commanders developed a philosophy that embraced chaos rather than trying to eliminate it, training their men to expect dispersion and to turn scattered landings into tactical advantages. As American forces consolidated their positions in North Africa throughout late 1942 and early 1943, German strategic planners began to recognize that they faced a new type of opponent in the American airborne divisions. Intelligence reports described American paratroopers who fought with a combination of individual initiative and unit cohesion that differed markedly from European military traditions. These soldiers appeared capable of operating independently for extended periods while maintaining focus on their primary objectives, a capability that would prove increasingly valuable as the war expanded into more complex theaters of operation. The success of American forces in North Africa, culminating in the surrender of all Axis forces on May 13, 1943, validated the concept of large-scale airborne operations and set the stage for even more ambitious plans. The 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, now combat-tested and confident, would soon be joined by entire airborne divisions as Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Sicily and ultimately the liberation of Western Europe. The German officers who had initially mocked American airborne capabilities now faced the prospect of confronting thousands of these elite soldiers in operations that would test the very foundations of Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. The transformation of American paratroopers from experimental units to combat-proven elite forces represented more than tactical evolution. It demonstrated a uniquely American approach to military innovation that combined individual initiative with industrial capability. As the focus of the war shifted toward Europe, German commanders would discover that their early dismissal of American airborne forces had been a critical miscalculation that would have far-reaching consequences for air ability to defend occupied territory against increasingly sophisticated Allied operations. The dawn of July 10, 1943, brought the roar of transport aircraft engines as the largest airborne operation yet attempted by American forces commenced over the Mediterranean Sea, targeting the heavily fortified island of Sicily. Operation Husky represented the first deployment of an entire American airborne division in combat, as the 82nd Airborne Division prepared to spearhead the Allied invasion of what German commanders considered the gateway to southern Europe. The scale and ambition of this operation far exceeded anything previously attempted by American forces, yet German intelligence continued to underestimate both the tactical capabilities and strategic implications of large-scale airborne operations. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division faced a complex mission that required simultaneous seizure of multiple objectives across southeastern Sicily. Unlike the scattered drops of Operation Torch, this operation demanded precise coordination between parachute and glider-borne forces, with specific units assigned to capture key bridges, road junctions, and airfields that would facilitate the main Allied landing. The German and Italian defenders, commanded by experienced officers who had observed earlier Allied airborne operations, expected to face limited parachute drops that could be contained through conventional defensive measures. The reality of American airborne operations in Sicily shattered these expectations as thousands of paratroopers descended across a wide area, creating multiple crises simultaneously for Axis commanders. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, despite being scattered by high winds and anti-aircraft fire, quickly coalesced into effective fighting units that seized their primary objectives within hours of landing. Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 505th, demonstrated the aggressive leadership style that would characterize American airborne operations throughout the war, personally leading his men in direct assaults against fortified positions that conventional wisdom suggested should be bypassed. German defenders, many of whom were veterans of airborne operations in Crete, expected American paratroopers to follow established European tactics of consolidation and methodical advance. Instead, they encountered soldiers who combined individual initiative with unit cohesion in ways that seemed to violate conventional military doctrine. American paratroopers advanced immediately toward their objectives, regardless of their numerical disadvantage, using mobility and aggressive action to overcome defensive positions that should have been impregnable to lightly armed airborne forces. The capture of key terrain features across Sicily demonstrated the evolution of American airborne doctrine since North Africa. Paratroopers no longer simply seized and held objectives. They actively disrupted enemy communications, severed supply lines, and created conditions that facilitated the advance of conventional forces. This integrated approach to airborne operations represented a sophistication that German intelligence had failed to anticipate, as American forces demonstrated the ability to coordinate complex operations across multiple echelons simultaneously. The success in Sicily led directly to expanded airborne operations during the Italian campaign, as Allied commanders gained confidence in the strategic potential of large-scale parachute operations. The 82nd Airborne Division's combat jump at Salerno in September 1943 marked another evolution in American airborne capabilities, as paratroopers were used to reinforce a contested beachhead rather than simply seizing initial objectives. This flexibility in employment demonstrated that American airborne forces had transcended their original role as specialized assault troops to become a strategic reserve capable of decisive intervention at critical moments. German defensive planning in Italy struggled to account for the unpredictability of American airborne operations. Wehrmacht commanders, accustomed to dealing with British forces that followed established tactical patterns, found American paratroopers difficult to counter because their operations seemed to violate conventional military logic. Units that should have required extensive preparation and logistical support appeared capable of sustained combat operations immediately upon landing, while scattered groups of paratroopers demonstrated an ability to coordinate their actions across vast distances without conventional communication systems. The individual fighting quality of American paratroopers also surprised German observers, who had expected colonial troops with limited combat effectiveness. Intelligence reports from Italian operations described American soldiers who fought with a combination of technical proficiency and aggressive determination that exceeded European expectations. These paratroopers appeared capable of mastering complex weapon systems while maintaining the physical conditioning necessary for extended combat operations in difficult terrain, a combination that German training doctrine suggested was impossible to achieve in the time frame American forces had been in existence. The strategic implications of successful American airborne operations in the Mediterranean theater extended far beyond immediate tactical results. German High Command began to recognize that Allied airborne capabilities represented a fundamental threat to their defensive strategy in Western Europe. The ability to project significant combat power deep behind enemy lines created vulnerabilities that conventional defensive planning could not address, particularly when combined with the increasing Allied superiority in transport aircraft and escort fighters. As 1943 drew to a close and Allied planning shifted toward the liberation of Western Europe, German commanders faced the unsettling realization that their early dismissal of American airborne capabilities had been a strategic miscalculation of enormous proportions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, now combat-tested and confident, represented a threat that could not be countered through conventional defensive measures. The paratroopers, who had been mocked as inexperienced amateurs, had proven themselves capable of achievements that veteran German units would have found challenging, setting the stage for operations that would fundamentally alter the course of the war in Europe. The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, concealed the largest airborne armada in military history as more than 13,000 American paratroopers prepared to spearhead the liberation of Western Europe. Operation Overlord represented the culmination of 2 years of American airborne development, yet German intelligence remained convinced that the primary Allied assault would come at the Pas de Calais, where the Wehrmacht had concentrated its strongest defensive forces. This massive deception, Operation Fortitude, had successfully masked not only the location of the invasion, but also the true scale and sophistication of American airborne capabilities. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, now veteran formations with combat experience in North Africa, Sicily and Italy, carried the hopes of Allied liberation as their C-47 transports crossed the English Channel toward the Normandy coast. German commanders, still influenced by their earlier assessments of American airborne forces as limited capability units, had deployed their reserves based on expectations of small-scale parachute drops that could be contained through local counterattacks. The reality of what was approaching the French coast would shatter these assumptions and paralyze German defensive planning during the critical first hours of the invasion. Major General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division received the mission of securing the western flank of the invasion beaches with specific objectives, including the capture of Sainte-Mère-Église and the establishment of defensive positions that would prevent German counterattacks against Utah Beach. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Maxwell Taylor, was tasked with seizing the causeway exits behind Utah Beach and securing the inland approaches that would allow the 4th Infantry Division to advance off the beaches. These missions required a level of coordination and tactical sophistication that German observers believed exceeded American airborne capabilities. The German response to the initial airborne landings revealed the extent to which Wehrmacht intelligence had underestimated American capabilities. As reports of parachute landings reached German command posts throughout Normandy, confusion spread rapidly through the defensive chain of command. The scale of the American airborne operation exceeded German estimates by a factor of 10. While the geographic dispersion of landings created the impression of simultaneous attacks across the entire region. German commanders found themselves unable to determine the main thrust of the assault, exactly as Allied planners had intended. The individual performance of American paratroopers during the first hours of D-Day demonstrated how far these forces had evolved since their initial combat operations in North Africa. Despite widespread scattering caused by clouds and anti-aircraft fire, small groups of soldiers quickly organized themselves and began advancing toward their assigned objectives. Unlike their earlier operations, where confusion and dispersion had hindered effectiveness, American paratroopers now treated scattered landings as opportunities to create multiple simultaneous crises for German defenders. The tactical flexibility displayed by American airborne forces during the Normandy landings particularly impressed German observers who had expected rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Colonel Alexis von Roene, analyzing Allied operations for foreign armies west, noted that American paratroopers demonstrated an unusual ability to adapt their missions to changing circumstances while maintaining focus on strategic objectives. Units that landed miles from their intended drop zones successfully identified alternative approaches to their targets, while commanders at all levels showed initiative in modifying their tactics based on local conditions. The psychological impact of American airborne operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical achievements. German units that had never encountered paratroopers found themselves facing an enemy that appeared from the sky without warning, disrupting defensive plans that had been based on expectations of conventional amphibious assault. The mere presence of American soldiers behind German lines created uncertainty that prevented effective coordination of counterattacks, while reports of parachute landings forced commanders to disperse their reserves rather than concentrating them against the main beachhead. Within 12 hours of the initial landings, American airborne forces had achieved most of their primary objectives, with the 82nd Airborne Division capturing Sainte-Mère-Église as the first French town to be liberated, and the 101st Airborne Division securing the critical causeway exits behind Utah Beach. These achievements required not only individual courage, but also the sophisticated coordination of multiple unit actions across a wide geographic area. German intelligence officers, analyzing the rapid success of American operations, began to understand that they had fundamentally misjudged both the tactical capabilities and strategic implications of Allied airborne forces. The success of D-Day airborne operations validated years of American military innovation and demonstrated that the United States had developed airborne capabilities that exceeded those of any other nation. The German officers, who had initially dismissed American paratroopers as inexperienced volunteers, now faced the reality that these forces had achieved in hours what conventional military wisdom suggested should have required days or weeks. The paratroopers, who had been mocked as colonial amateurs, had proven themselves capable of tactical achievements that would reshape German defensive planning for the remainder of the war. As Allied forces consolidated their beachhead and prepared for the liberation of France, German strategic planners confronted the uncomfortable truth that their intelligence assessments had been catastrophically wrong. The American airborne divisions that had seemed like expensive experiments in 1942 now represented one of the most capable military forces in the world, setting the stage for operations that would demonstrate even more dramatically the evolution of American combat effectiveness since the beginning of the war. September 17, 1944, dawned clear and bright as the largest single-day airborne operation in military history commenced over the Dutch countryside, with more than 35,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops preparing to execute Field Marshal Montgomery's ambitious Operation Market Garden. The 82nd Airborne Division, now commanded by the experienced James Gavin, received orders to capture the vital bridges at Nijmegen and establish defensive positions on the Groesbeek Heights, missions that would test every lesson learned during 2 years of combat operations across 3 theaters of war. German intelligence, despite witnessing the devastating effectiveness of Allied airborne operations in Normandy, continued to underestimate the tactical flexibility and combat power that American paratroopers could bring to bear against defensive positions. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B in the Netherlands, had positioned his reserves based on conventional military logic that assumed airborne forces would require extensive consolidation periods before attempting major operations. This assessment would prove to be another significant miscalculation in the German understanding of American airborne capabilities. The 82nd Airborne Division's mission in Operation Market Garden represented the most complex airborne operation yet attempted by American forces, requiring simultaneous seizure of multiple bridge objectives while establishing a defensive perimeter capable of withstanding German counterattacks. Unlike previous operations where paratroopers seized isolated objectives and awaited relief, Market Garden demanded that airborne forces hold critical terrain for an extended period while facilitating the advance of armored columns over a narrow exposed route. German commanders expected this complexity to overwhelm American coordination capabilities and create opportunities for decisive counterattacks. The initial phases of the operation demonstrated the evolution of American airborne doctrine since the early disasters of North Africa. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment successfully captured the bridge at Grave within hours of landing, while other elements of the division secured their assigned positions on the Groesbeek Heights. These achievements required not only individual unit effectiveness, but also sophisticated coordination between scattered formations operating across a wide geographic area. German observers noted that American paratroopers displayed an operational tempo that seemed inconsistent with the logistical limitations imposed by parachute operations. However, the German response to Market Garden also revealed the limits of airborne operations when faced with prepared defensive positions and concentrated armored forces. The delay in capturing the Nijmegen bridges, caused by the 82nd Airborne Division's prioritization of the Groesbeek Heights over immediate bridge seizure, provided German commanders with crucial time to organize their defenses and deploy reserves from other sectors. This tactical decision, logical from a defensive perspective, demonstrated that even experienced airborne forces faced difficult choices when assigned multiple simultaneous objectives. The fighting for Nijmegen Bridge became a crucible that tested both American airborne capabilities and German defensive effectiveness under conditions that neither side had previously encountered. American paratroopers, supported by British armor, conducted a daylight assault crossing of the Waal River that German defenders considered tactically impossible for lightly equipped airborne forces. The success of this operation, achieved despite heavy casualties, demonstrated that American airborne forces had developed capabilities that exceeded German expectations even after years of combat observation. German defensive performance during Market Garden also reflected growing respect for American airborne capabilities. SS and Wehrmacht units that had initially dismissed American paratroopers as colonial troops now prepared elaborate defensive positions and concentrated significant resources against airborne objectives. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, fighting against American paratroopers in Holland, employed tactics specifically developed to counter the mobility and aggressive action that characterized American airborne operations. This adaptation represented tacit acknowledgement that German forces could no longer rely on conventional defensive measures against American airborne attacks. The strategic outcome of Market Garden, despite its failure to achieve ultimate objectives, demonstrated the maturation of American airborne forces into a strategic asset capable of independent operations deep behind enemy lines. The 82nd Airborne Division maintained its positions in Holland for 72 days, far exceeding the original operational timeline and proving that American paratroopers could sustain extended combat operations without the immediate relief that previous airborne doctrine had required. This capability fundamentally altered German defensive planning, as Wehrmacht commanders could no longer assume that airborne forces represented only short-term tactical threats. The individual performance of American soldiers during the extended Holland campaign impressed even veteran German officers who had initially questioned American military effectiveness. Intelligence reports described paratroopers who maintained unit cohesion and combat effectiveness despite weeks of continuous operations in adverse weather conditions. These soldiers demonstrated a combination of technical proficiency and physical endurance that German training doctrine suggested required years of military service to develop, yet American volunteers had achieved this standard within months of entering combat. As autumn progressed and Market Garden transitioned from offensive operation to defensive commitment, German strategic planners confronted the reality that American airborne forces had evolved beyond their original conception as specialized assault troops. The paratroopers, who had been dismissed as expensive experiments, now represented one of the most capable military formations in the Allied order of battle, capable of achieving tactical objectives that conventional forces would find challenging and sustaining operations that exceeded the endurance of many regular infantry divisions. The lessons of Market Garden would prove crucial as both sides prepared for the final campaigns of the European War, with German commanders finally acknowledging that their early assessments of American airborne capabilities had been fundamentally flawed, and American forces continuing to innovate tactical solutions that would surprise even experienced Wehrmacht veterans. December 16, 1944, shattered the winter quiet of the Ardennes forest as Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the massive German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The surprise attack caught Allied forces completely unprepared, with intelligence estimates indicating that German forces lacked both the strength and fuel reserves necessary for sustained offensive operations. Yet within hours, 250,000 German troops, supported by over 1,200 armored vehicles, were advancing rapidly through weakly held American positions, creating the largest crisis faced by Allied forces since the Normandy landings. The German breakthrough achieved tactical surprise on a scale that Allied commanders had believed impossible in late 1944, demonstrating that Wehrmacht capabilities had been seriously underestimated by Allied intelligence. The only strategic reserves available to General Eisenhower consisted of the 16th Airborne Corps, comprising the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, both of which were resting in rear areas after their extended deployment during Operation Market Garden. The irony was not lost on German planners that the same American paratroopers they had initially dismissed as colonial amateurs now represented the sole Allied units capable of immediate deployment against the German offensive. Major General James Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division received orders on December 17th to move without delay to the northern shoulder of the German Bulge, where they would be tasked with holding the vital road junction at St. Vith. The mission represented a fundamental shift in airborne employment, as these elite troops would be fighting not as shock assault forces, but as conventional infantry defending fixed positions against numerically superior armored formations. German commanders, confident in their tactical advantages, expected to overwhelm American airborne forces through the application of concentrated armor and artillery that had proven effective against other Allied units. The deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division to the Ardennes demonstrated the organizational flexibility that American forces had developed during 3 years of global warfare. Within 24 hours of receiving their orders, the entire division had moved by truck convoy from rear areas in France to combat positions in Belgium, a rate of strategic mobility that German intelligence had not anticipated. This rapid deployment capability reflected not only improved logistics, but also the institutional learning that had transformed American military effectiveness since the early disasters of 1942. The German assault against positions held by the 82nd Airborne Division began with overwhelming force, as the 2nd and 9th SS Panzer Divisions attacked with the expectation that American airborne forces would collapse under sustained armored pressure. Instead, German commanders encountered paratroopers who had learned to integrate infantry anti-tank tactics with the aggressive individual fighting characteristics that had marked their earlier operations. The Americans demonstrated an ability to absorb heavy casualties while maintaining unit cohesion that surprised Wehrmacht veterans who had expected colonial troops to break under sustained pressure. The fighting along the northern shoulder of the Bulge revealed both the strengths and limitations of elite airborne forces when employed as conventional infantry. American paratroopers, equipped with limited anti-tank weapons and lacking the heavy artillery support available to regular infantry divisions, nonetheless managed to delay and channel German armored advances through a combination of tactical innovation and individual courage. They employed obstacles and prepared positions with a sophistication that reflected their experience in diverse combat environments, while maintaining the aggressive spirit that had characterized their operations since North Africa. For the first time in its combat history, the 82nd Airborne Division was forced to conduct a tactical withdrawal as German pressure became overwhelming. However, even this retreat demonstrated the tactical flexibility that distinguished American airborne forces from conventional infantry. The withdrawal was conducted in good order, with minimal loss of equipment, while maintaining sufficient unit cohesion to transition immediately to counterattack operations when German momentum faltered. This performance under adverse conditions validated years of training that had emphasized adaptability and initiative at all command levels. The German failure to achieve breakthrough on the northern shoulder of the Bulge marked a turning point in Wehrmacht offensive capabilities and German perceptions of American fighting quality. Despite achieving numerical superiority of more than 5-1 and possessing overwhelming advantages in armor and artillery, German forces had been unable to decisively defeat a single American airborne division fighting on ground of their enemy's choosing. Intelligence reports reaching German high command described American soldiers whose fighting effectiveness exceeded all previous estimates and whose unit cohesion remained intact despite suffering casualties that should have rendered them combat ineffective. The transition from defensive to offensive operations in January 1945 demonstrated the rapid recovery capability that characterized American airborne forces throughout the war. The 82nd Airborne Division, after absorbing heavy casualties during the defensive phase, immediately launched coordinated attacks that recaptured lost territory and captured over 2,400 German prisoners. This operational tempo reflected not only the individual resilience of American paratroopers, but also the logistical and replacement systems that maintained unit effectiveness despite extended combat operations. The Battle of the Bulge represented the final evolution of American airborne forces, from experimental units to mature military formations capable of decisive independent action. German commanders, who had begun the war dismissing American military capabilities, now faced paratroopers whose tactical flexibility and fighting effectiveness exceeded that of many Wehrmacht formations. The soldiers, who had been mocked as inexperienced volunteers, had proven themselves capable of achievements that would have challenged the best German units, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of forces in Western Europe as the war entered its final phase. The morning of March 24, 1945, witnessed the culmination of American airborne development as Operation Varsity commenced, the largest single-day airborne operation in military history, with over 17,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops crossing the Rhine River to establish the definitive bridgehead into the heart of Nazi Germany. The 17th Airborne Division, America's newest airborne formation, would join British forces in an operation that German commanders recognized as potentially decisive for the defense of the fatherland. After nearly 3 years of underestimating American airborne capabilities, Wehrmacht intelligence finally acknowledged that these forces represented the most dangerous threat to German defensive positions. The strategic context of Operation Varsity differed fundamentally from previous airborne operations, as Allied forces were now conducting offensive operations deep within German territory against an enemy whose defensive capabilities had been honed through months of retreat. The 17th Airborne Division, despite being the newest American airborne formation, carried the institutional knowledge and tactical innovations developed through years of combat experience by the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. German defenders, commanded by officers who had personally witnessed the effectiveness of American paratroopers in multiple theaters, prepared elaborate defensive measures specifically designed to counter airborne operations. The execution of Operation Varsity demonstrated the technological and tactical sophistication that American airborne forces had achieved by the final year of the war. Transport aircraft formations, supported by fighter escorts, delivered paratroopers with precision that would have been impossible during the scattered drops of 1942 and 1943. The coordination between air and ground elements reflected years of operational refinement that had transformed airborne operations from experimental tactics into proven military science. German observers noted that American airborne forces now possessed capabilities that exceeded those of the original German Fallschirmjäger who had pioneered airborne warfare. The German defensive response to Operation Varsity revealed the extent to which Wehrmacht doctrine had been modified to address the specific threat posed by American airborne operations. Concentrated anti-aircraft artillery, pre-positioned reserves, and elaborate obstacle systems all reflected tactical innovations developed specifically to counter the mobility and aggressive action that characterized American paratroopers. The intensity of German resistance demonstrated that Wehrmacht commanders no longer viewed airborne forces as limited capability units, but rather as strategic threats requiring maximum defensive effort. The individual performance of American soldiers during Operation Varsity reflected the maturation of airborne training and doctrine that had occurred since the early experiments of 1942. Despite encountering the heaviest anti-aircraft fire of the war, paratroopers maintained unit cohesion and achieved their assigned objectives with a rapidity that German defenders found difficult to counter. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, despite being dropped several miles from their intended landing zones, quickly oriented themselves and began attacking German positions in their vicinity while simultaneously advancing toward their primary objectives. The tactical innovations displayed during Operation Varsity demonstrated American military adaptability at its finest, as airborne planners attempted to solve the chronic shortage of transport aircraft through the employment of double-towed gliders. While this expedient resulted in significant casualties during the approach phase, it enabled the deployment of artillery and heavy equipment that dramatically enhanced the combat power of airborne forces once they reached their objectives. German intelligence reports noted that American paratroopers now possessed firepower capabilities that approached those of conventional infantry divisions, fundamentally altering the tactical equation of airborne operations. The strategic success of Operation Varsity, despite suffering the highest single-day casualties in airborne history, validated the transformation of American airborne forces from experimental units to decisive military formations. Within hours of landing, Allied paratroopers had seized all assigned objectives and established defensive positions that facilitated the advance of conventional forces across the Rhine. This achievement represented not only tactical success, but also the culmination of 3 years of military innovation that had created capabilities no other nation possessed. The German reaction to Operation Varsity reflected the complete transformation of Wehrmacht attitudes toward American military capabilities that had occurred during the course of the war. Intelligence reports reaching German high command described American paratroopers whose tactical effectiveness exceeded that of elite Wehrmacht formations, while their logistical support and equipment standardization demonstrated industrial capabilities that Germany could no longer match. The soldiers who had been dismissed as inexperienced colonials in 1942 now represented the most advanced military forces in the world. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany during the final weeks of the war, German commanders confronted the uncomfortable reality that their initial assessments of American military potential had been catastrophically wrong. The airborne divisions that had seemed like expensive experiments had proven capable of tactical achievements that surpassed the performance of veteran Wehrmacht units, while their strategic mobility and operational flexibility had fundamentally altered the nature of modern warfare. The paratroopers, who had been mocked by German officers, now stood as testimony to American military innovation and industrial capability. The final airborne operations of the European War demonstrated that American forces had not only mastered existing tactical concepts, but had transcended them to create new forms of military capability. The institutional learning that had transformed scattered and confused drops in North Africa into the precision operations of 1945 reflected a systematic approach to military improvement that would influence warfare for generations to come. As the guns fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the transformation of American airborne forces from experimental formations to the world's most capable elite infantry represented one of the most remarkable military developments of the Second World War. The journey from the scattered drops over North Africa in November 1942 to the precision assault across the Rhine River in March 1945 demonstrated not only tactical evolution, but a fundamental revolution in the American approach to warfare that would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The statistical record of American airborne achievements spoke to capabilities that had exceeded even the most optimistic projections of their creators. 3 airborne divisions had participated in every major Allied operation from Sicily through the final assault on Germany, consistently achieving objectives that conventional military wisdom suggested were beyond the capabilities of lightly equipped parachute forces. The 82nd Airborne Division alone had conducted combat operations across 4 different theaters, demonstrating a strategic mobility and tactical flexibility that no other military formation in history had achieved. German post-war analyses revealed the extent to which Wehrmacht intelligence had failed to anticipate the true potential of American airborne forces. Major von der Heydter, writing for professional military journals in the immediate aftermath of the war, provided what many historians consider the definitive German assessment of American airborne capabilities. His analysis acknowledged that German commanders had fundamentally misunderstood both the individual fighting quality of American soldiers and the industrial capacity that supported their operations. The Americans had demonstrated an ability to transform civilian volunteers into elite soldiers within timeframes that German military doctrine considered impossible. The technological innovations developed to support American airborne operations represented advances that extended far beyond military applications. Improved aircraft design, precision navigation equipment, and specialized weapon systems all reflected the American approach to warfare that emphasized technological solutions to tactical problems. German observers noted that American paratroopers possessed equipment standardization and logistical support systems that exceeded those available to Wehrmacht elite formations, demonstrating industrial capabilities that Germany could no longer match by the final years of the war. The tactical doctrines developed by American airborne forces during the war represented fundamental innovations in military science that influenced post-war developments across multiple nations. The concept of vertical envelopment, refined through years of combat experience, demonstrated that properly equipped and trained airborne forces could achieve strategic objectives that had previously required conventional armies. The flexibility and adaptability displayed by American paratroopers created new possibilities for military planning that commanders had not previously considered feasible. The individual transformation of American soldiers from civilian volunteers to elite paratroopers represented perhaps the most significant achievement of the entire airborne program. German intelligence reports consistently noted the unusual combination of individual initiative and unit cohesion that characterized American airborne forces, qualities that European military traditions suggested required years of professional military service to develop. The ability of American training systems to produce such soldiers within months rather than years demonstrated institutional capabilities that would have profound implications for post-war military development. The strategic impact of American airborne operations extended far beyond their immediate tactical achievements, fundamentally altering German defensive planning throughout the war. The mere existence of capable Allied airborne forces forced Wehrmacht commanders to disperse reserves and prepare defenses against threats that could materialize anywhere within transport aircraft range. This defensive burden consumed resources and attention that might otherwise have been concentrated against conventional Allied operations, contributing significantly to the overall Allied victory. The legacy of American airborne forces in World War II established precedents that would influence military development throughout the Cold War period and beyond. The institutional knowledge gained through 3 years of intensive combat operations provided the foundation for advanced airborne and air assault capabilities that would distinguish American military forces for decades. The combination of tactical innovation, technological advancement, and individual soldier quality that characterized wartime airborne forces became hallmarks of American military excellence. The German officers who had initially mocked American paratroopers as inexperienced colonials were forced to acknowledge by war's end that they had witnessed the emergence of military capabilities that exceeded their own. The transformation of American airborne forces represented more than tactical success. It demonstrated a uniquely American approach to warfare that combined individual initiative with industrial capacity to create military capabilities that other nations found difficult to replicate. The paratroopers, who had been dismissed as expensive experiments, had proven themselves capable of achievements that would have challenged the finest military formations in history. As veterans of the American airborne divisions returned home to civilian life, they carried with them not only individual memories of extraordinary achievement, but also the collective knowledge of how democratic societies could mobilize their human and industrial resources to meet existential challenges. The transformation they had undergone from volunteers to elite soldiers represented proof that free societies possessed advantages in warfare that totalitarian systems could not match, lessons that would prove crucial during the confrontations of the Cold War era that lay ahead. The story of American paratroopers in World War II represents more than a tactical evolution in military science. It embodies the transformation of an entire nation's approach to warfare and the validation of democratic principles under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. From the scattered and confused drops over North African airfields in November 1942 to the precision assault across the Rhine River in March 1945, American airborne forces demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally altered the nature of modern warfare, while proving that free societies could produce military excellence that exceeded authoritarian alternatives. The German officers, who had initially dismissed American paratroopers as inexperienced amateurs, learned through bitter experience that they had underestimated not only individual American fighting capabilities, but also the industrial and institutional systems that supported them. The transformation of civilian volunteers into elite soldiers within months, rather than years, challenged fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness. While the technological innovations developed to support airborne operations demonstrated American advantages in applied science and manufacturing that would influence warfare for generations to come. The legacy of World War II American airborne forces extended far beyond their immediate military achievements, establishing precedents for military excellence that would distinguish American armed forces throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The institutional knowledge gained through 3 years of intensive combat operations provided the foundation for advanced airborne and air assault capabilities that would prove crucial in subsequent conflicts, while the tactical innovations developed by wartime paratroopers became standard doctrine adopted by military forces worldwide. Perhaps most significantly, the success of American airborne forces validated the fundamental principle that democratic societies, when properly mobilized and equipped, could produce military capabilities that totalitarian regimes found impossible to match. The paratroopers, who had been mocked as colonial volunteers, had demonstrated that individual initiative, combined with technological superiority and logistical excellence, could overcome numerical disadvantages and tactical surprise to achieve victory against the most experienced military forces in the world. The thunder of transport aircraft engines that had once carried American paratroopers into combat over Europe fell silent with the end of World War II, but the principles they embodied, excellence through training, success through innovation, and victory through the application of free societies' advantages, continue to guide American military forces as they face the challenges of an uncertain world.